Secunda Kamani. Dozens of world leaders and security chiefs have gathered in Germany to discuss international crises like the conflict in Ukraine and tensions between Russia and the West. And of course, how future security cooperation might work after Brexit. The British Prime Minister Theresa May has addressed the gathering and called for a strong partnership with Europe after the UK leaves the EU. The BBC's Jonathan Marcus has more from Munich. Well, let's get more on that story with our BBC Chief International Correspondent Lyse Doucet, who is at the conference for us in Munich. Good to see you, Lyse, even though it's heavily snowing down there. First of all, there's been a lot of chat about security post-Brexit, but given all the other conflicts in the world, how much is that playing at this conference?
Well, when you have a gathering which is focusing on warnings that there's a real risk of a war in the Middle East, where there's a real risk of a nuclear confrontation on the Korean Peninsula, where there's a real risk of even deteriorating relations between Russia and the West, what's happening on Brexit is not the main issue on people's minds. Partly because Brexit is still a process. No one is clear how and when it will end. But there was a message from the British Prime Minister Theresa May today, and her message was that even after Brexit, after Britain leaves the European Union, that Britain really still wants to play an important role when it comes to intelligence sharing, when it comes to defence cooperation, and her message was that this should go beyond politics and ideology because Britain has something to offer, and that is certainly the view of security chiefs here and intelligence chiefs who believe that Britain has a role to play quite beyond what its particular relationship is to the European Union as an institution and a union.
Lyse, you mentioned conflicts around the world, and one of them was the real risk of war in the Middle East. Was there a sense that there was anything to be done about that to avoid things deteriorating further?
It's interesting you asked this question. I've been discussing with some diplomats and defense ministers here that in previous years what we saw was that there was at a forum which is not just about talking. There's always real-time diplomacy here at the Munich Security Conference. But in previous years, we saw the beginning of the Minsk agreement for Ukraine. We saw an agreement on a cessation of hostilities in Syria. This year, we're not seeing any of that. We're seeing a lot of people worried about the situation. We're seeing a lot of people talking about the need for dialogue, but very little seems to be happening on the ground. There are discussions behind closed doors, but basically people are stating their points of view. Take the Middle East, for example. Tomorrow will be the day we'll hear from the Saudi foreign minister, we'll hear from the Iranian foreign minister, we'll hear from the Turkish foreign minister, but there's no sense in which they're willing to move back from their positions, and the real risk of a confrontation in Syria because there's simply the positions are too far apart.
We know Russia is there today, and we often hear that Russia and China, two big players, are really key in getting some sort of international consensus to get some sort of stability in the Middle East. What have they been saying about this issue?
Well, Russia often takes a defensive position here because they're often under attack either by NATO for what they see as the expansion of Russian forces in the region. This year, of course, Russia is in focus because the United States and Britain and its allies have said that the Russian military was beyond a malicious attack, a cyber attack last year in Ukraine, which had global consequences. When Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, took to the podium here in Munich, he tried to play down those tensions, tried to steer everyone away from saying it was an us-them kind of a Cold War polarity, if you like, with some countries backing Russia and some countries backing the West. There are those, of course, who believe in it, and of course it is the reality that these big powers have to find a way to overcome their divisions. But a lot of the emphasis is here on the kind of threats which go between them. Some of the new threats, which are cyber threats, and some of the very old ones, which seem to go back to the origins of the Cold War.
All right, Lyse Doucet, our Chief International Correspondent, thank you very much for that assessment from that security conference in Munich.